Thanks for finding Discovery Class. What was a man known as a man after God's own heart doing in the city of Ziklag? Well, he was there because he was in trouble. I wonder if we're in trouble too. As you look out onto your world, do you face events way beyond your control? You sit back, and when you watch them, you almost feel powerless. That's how I feel. You see wars, and you hear of wars and rumors of wars. You face all kinds of environmental problems. They're in the news all the time. Your bills are piling up. Your kids at school are told they don't know who they are yet. Leadership in high places is under review, and I'm finding a lot of families are falling apart. What do? You just can't sidestep it. You got to do something. Do you find that you slip into despair? You pretend that your universe is nothing more than maybe nothing but quantum physics? There's nothing out there, only particles and empty space? If that's the case, the chances are you're saying, well, why not just live for me? Be selfish. During the Roman Empire, all those very same thoughts were in the minds of the nobility. And they formed a philosophy called the Epicureans. What it meant was, you just simply seek pleasure and you avoid pain. If pleasure isn't around, pain is. So let's go after pleasure and forget the pain. Well, that was our answer to everything. That's the secret. When you feel things that you can't control and are falling apart, and you can't do anything more than that, that's the answer. Well, that isn't the answer, because that's very shallow thinking. Because that's all based on luck. You're constantly grabbing for accidental circumstances just to give you some good health and maybe a lot of wealth. But what about you and me? We suffer misfortune. We got all kinds of hardship. But that doesn't do anything really for my outlook in life. There lived in the 16th century, in Britain, a man who provided an alternative to that kind of thinking. And I must say that he was a rare instance of a great thinker. He invested considerable time studying his society, seeing how fragile his society was, and then he sought a more permanent truth, something to satisfy the common man down on the street who's been struggling just for existence. So what did he do? He wrote a book about it. And it became one of the most famous books ever to be written. The man's name was John Bunyan. The year was 1676. That's 100 years before the writing of the American Constitution in 1776. The man was a Puritan preacher. Charles II, the ruler of Britain, he didn't like what he was preaching. So what did he do? He threw him into prison. And he was living in Bedford, England. I've been there. I've seen that prison. And he came from a very humble family. His father mended pots and pans. And if he was given a name, he'd be probably called a tinkerer. 3 times, John Bunyan was thrown into prison. And he served 12 years in that prison. The man was married. He had 4 kids. His oldest child, his daughter, was born blind. But the man was a real warrior. When his wife died and he was left with these 4 kids, he still carried on and he still managed. Great guy. The book he wrote in prison was called Pilgrim's Progress. It became the only Bible in the poor homes in Britain, and it really changed the lives of millions of people around the world. The story is very simple. Even a child can read it and understand it. If I was a superintendent of education here in Alberta, I think I would make Bunyan's book required reading for all the children in grade 5 in elementary school. The character in Bunyan's story was a person called Pilgrim. He's making a long journey, and he's going to leave from his city of despair, and he's going to head for the city of God called the Celestial City. And the trip is going to be long, it's going to be hard, and it's going to be very arduous. He meets all kinds of people on the journey. One time he falls into a muddy mud hole. It's called the Slough of Despond. And he's stuck there. He can't get out by himself. He cries for help. A man comes along and helps pull him out, whose name is Faithful. And he hears his cry and he pulls him out. And if you read the book, you would find that all of us, we have ended up in a mud hole called the Slough of Despond. You can't avoid them. We've been studying the life of David in the Old Testament. Today, he's going to fall into the Slough of Despond. How he got there, how he gets out, is going to be my lesson today. David is going to be in that mud hole for 16 months. And it begins in the 27th chapter of the book of 1 Samuel. David is speaking, and he says to himself, sooner or later, Saul is going to get me. And the best thing that I can do is escape to the Philistine country. Saul then, he will see that I am a lost cause, and he'll quit hunting me down, and every nook and cranny in Israel he won't find me, and I'll be out of his reach for good. David, he's depressed. Have you ever been depressed? Well, we've all been depressed. You can't avoid it. I don't care what age you are, you're going to get it. For some, it might last for just a day. For others, maybe it'll last for a week. Some longer. David's lasted for 16 months. And there's no record that we have during that time that he ever prayed. God wasn't in the picture at all. He never talked to God in those 16 months. And we don't see that he ever wrote a psalm. And if you look at your Bible, half of the Psalms were written by David. None of them were written during this period. Pessimism usually precedes depression. You feel sorry for yourself. Have you ever done that? Poor me. You retreat into the cellar of your soul, you turn all the lights out, and down there you just sort of grapple. Have you ever done that? If you're in a service industry, like I am as a pastor, you're going to find that people will let you down. And it doesn't matter what the people are, who they are, where they come from, you're going to get caught in that. And a good pastor is a shepherd. He looks after his sheep, and his sheep call him by name. But one of the things you face, you're sort of caught halfway between being a town pump, giving out a nice drink of water, and on the other side, you have to be a lightning rod taking other people's charges. You better make sure you're grounded. I have a little ditty on the wall of my office that reads, "We the willing, led by the unknowing, are doing the impossible for the ungrateful. We've done so much for so long with so little, we're not qualified to do anything with nothing." That's a bit of a joke. But you know, when you look between the lines, there is some truth there. David says in verse 1 of 2 Samuel 27, I'm going to die. King Saul is out to get me. I'm going to perish one day by his hand. Saul's going to get me. There's a man by the name of Vincent van Gogh. Have you ever heard of him? He was a Dutch master. He started out as a pastor, trained in seminary, worked with the peasants over in Belgium in the coal industry, and then he became an artist. But the man suffered mental illness all his life. And the man picked a time when he was going to die, just like David. And 72 days before he died, the man worked night and day. He never hardly took a moment to sleep. During that time, he painted one painting every day for those days that he still had remaining to live. He was so depressed after he had finished his last painting that he took a gun and he shot himself. He killed himself. He committed suicide. And the irony was that one of those paintings that he had done was a painting of the church where he had gone to talk to the priest for counsel. But he was turned off and he was turned away, and the priest didn't give him any help at all. So when he painted the church with no windows. That church didn't give him any windows, so he painted the painting without any windows in the church. I've often wondered if Van Gogh hadn't taken his life, if he could paint all those paintings in the last few days of his life. Can you imagine how many paintings of sunflowers and starry nights and those black crows flying in the wheat field and even those boats along the shore of the ocean? Can you imagine how many of those he would have painted? Worry always follows depression. The future is bleak. Life is just one big downside. I'm going to die, said David. Isn't he the one in the Bible that was chosen and God had said, I chose him because he's a man after my own heart? Samuel had anointed him with oil. He had told him that one day he's going to be king. Do you remember Abigail? She had just told him, the Lord shall appoint you as ruler over Israel. Even his pal, Jonathan, more than once he assured him that you're going to be the next king, even though I am heir. Saul, the one who's after him, is going to take his life. He said to him, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. 2 Samuel 24:20. Do you know why he got depressed? When we're stuck in a mud hole and we cast our eyes on ourselves, depression doesn't come from the hand of the Lord. He doesn't provide it. David took his eyes off the Lord, and watch what he does. In 1 Samuel 27:2, he says, there's nothing better for me than to escape into the land of the Philistines. Land of the Philistines? David, that's enemy territory. David's behavior is going to be conducted by disobedience. There's all kinds of causes for depression. I'm not going to go into that. It could be loved ones, could be diet, maybe it's your work, maybe it's your pedigree, it's the weather. Lots of things put us in a mud hole. In 1 Samuel 27:1, it begins, then David said to himself. We all talk to ourselves. What did David say to himself? What put him in the mud hole? He says in verse 1, I'm going to die. There's nothing better for me to do. I'm going to escape into the land of the Philistines, the enemy. David, you got to be kidding. I know times are hard. Maybe you think at times that God has deserted you. I thought I was going to be king. That's what everybody told me, said David. Well, they're just joking. I'm never going to be king. I'm going to die. Saul's army is going to find me. They're going to hunt me down. And that's going to be the end of it. I don't have any way out. So I'm going to join the enemy. I'm going to side with the Philistines. There's a famous psychologist, Rollo May. He said this: man is the only animal that runs faster when he's lost his way. When you're depressed, you've lost your way. When you're down, you've lost your way. When you lose your way, chances are good that you're going to find the slough of despond and a mud hole. That slough of despond you find because you've run in the wrong direction. You run right into the hand of the enemy. When that happens, unfortunately, you don't do it alone. You drag others with you. In 1 Samuel 27, so David arose and he crossed over, he and 600 men who were with him, to Achish, king of Gath. And when David retreated into the enemy territory, the Bible says that all his guerrilla warfares who supported him, they all went with him. When you hit your mud hole, you take others with you. When you make a decision that's wrong, you choose an option that isn't part of God's plan, and it's going to affect everybody around you who trust in you and really depend on you. And if your choices are sinful, a lot of innocent people are going to end up in the same mud hole with you. It says here in our text, David, he fled to Gath. Where did you hear the term Gath before? Do you remember the giant that David killed called Goliath? That's where he came from. That was his hometown. Gath, David is going to go to his mud hole in Gath, the home of the giant, Achish, the king, the arch enemy of the Israelites. Do you think it's going to pay off? It says in verse 4 of 1 Samuel 27, it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he no longer searched for him. There's David. He's now in his new mud hole, and he's safe, and Saul will never catch him there. Well, that's wrong. You can't live there, David. Achish, the king, told David, Ziklag, the town, it's going to be your hiding place. It's going to be a sanctuary for you, David. You go and live there. So he did. And he went to Ziklag, there in the enemy territory of the Philistines, and he was there for 1 year and 4 months. And we have no record, as I said, during that time that David ever wrote a psalm, ever talked to God. He probably says in his heart, how can I sing the praises of God in a foreign land? You've heard that before. That was said by those that had been captives over in Babylon later on. It's hard to sing when you're up to your neck in a mud hole. Over these 16 months, the enemy, the Philistines, they've been watching David. They've been watching his troops. They've been watching their behavior. They've been watching their eating habits, how they live. Here's what they say about David and his men in verse 3 of 1 Samuel 29. Then the commander of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" David's enemy turns on him. Even his own troops, the ones that he's commanding, they begin to mutiny. They say to each other, "David, take us back home. Get us out of this slough of despond. Take us out of this mud hole. Take us back home." David is about to do something amazing. For 16 months, he has forgotten God. God has become very foreign to him. Up until this moment, God had directed all his steps. Remember back there as a shepherd in Bethlehem on the sheepfold? Do you remember what God had given to him all that time? Well, here in the mud hole in Ziklag, David let himself down, and he let God down, but he also let all his followers down. Today, God is looking for young men in our society, just like David. And more than any other class, he's looking for those young men that are going to correct evil, and they're going to change our society around. It seems the world I live in, the crimes are increasing. I'm sensing the laws are being more broken. I find that people are floundering. And during that time, God is on the watch for young men who are going to lead the charge for a fight that's going to make everything right. In this age of pornography and easy sex, those who advocate purity can often be cast as just nothing but prudes. They're sissified, and they're called weak. God's looking for young men who are a man after God's own heart. God wants you to have your passions not despised and blasted by sin. He wants them held and appreciated as a sacred possession. And you know what happens if that does go to take place? That young man can become the most attractive. That young man can be the most noble. And I think he can be the most magnetic. And I think he could be the best expression of manhood. When that happens, I think that the world has just witnessed the most fundamental and foundational building block that you could ever find in society. And you know what that building block is? It's called the family, where you live. Your purity of life is the platinum for happiness. That's what David believed, but he lost it. And he lost it for 16 months. When he came to his senses, he once again found the cornerstone. David forgot. So do we. He forgot that God was the moral and spiritual force that supplies man his highest needs. David remembered his God. Once again, he got out his pen. He started to write. He got on his knees. He looked out into that world that God had created. And he once again could say, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want another thing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He restores my soul." Do you have a good name? Most people don't know what C.S. Lewis meant. C.S. Lewis, remember him? He was that famous professor in Oxford, and he wrote all kinds of wonderful books like Mere Christianity and the Narnia series. He wrote all of that. Most people didn't know what C.S. meant. Well, when he was born, His mother and dad called him Clive's Staple. He hated that. Nobody's going to call me Clive Staple. I want a better name than that. Just call me CS. So that's what it was. All the days of his life, he was called Professor C.S. Lewis. I heard another young man. His name was T.J. Thompson. Do you know what the T.J. stood for? It stood for Thaddeus Josephus. Well, no wonder they called him J.T. When David left Gath, Ziklag, and his Philistine territory after 16 months, he once again claimed back his title, a man after God's own heart. Over the next weeks, when you come back to class, I'm going to tell you about a man called David who really was a man after God's own heart. I hope to see you then when you come back.